Recently, the White House announced that all federal buildings have to be built in the classical style in the future. So since my YouTube channel is about classical architecture, many of you ask me what I think about that. And to be honest, I'm not too happy about that because that politicized one more classical architecture. So we have that problem already before in Germany, because as you know, I'm a German architect, although I don't live in Germany. We had that problem already with the Nazi architecture, which used classicism, which existed already for a very long time at that point, and monumentalized it. And Albert Speer designed buildings for Hitler, which were the reason that after the Second World War, everyone said the modernists are the good ones and the classicism is the bad guy. So, and this happened kind of one more time, although I presume that when the Democrats rule again in America, that they will abandon that rule anyway. So, in this video, I want to explain you why I think that architecture itself is not moral. So that means it should not be seen political because it's not moral. Because first of all, morality requires in moral philosophy that you have a consciously acting subject. So someone who makes actively decisions. And architecture is just basically piles of stone, so they can't decide themselves. But here I want to explain in this video why I think that architecture is not moral and why also classicism is innocent, even when Donald Trump decides now and the White House make a rule that all federal buildings have to be built in the classical style from now on. So when we look on the Nazi architecture more carefully, we can see that yes, the Nazis closed the Bauhaus, but when we look, for example, at another country at the same time, at Italy, which was also fascistic, and actually Mussolini was the role model for Hitler, right? He modeled his leader, so his Führer idea around the Duce idea of Mussolini to be the leader, and Mussolini was his big role model. When we look there, what do we see? Looks pretty modern, right? So the Nazis closed the Bauhaus in 1933, yes, but actually, if we look in Italy in the 1920s, what they built looked not much different than the modernist architecture from Bauhaus and so on, also in the 1920s, so not a big difference. What instead happened, that was, and we see this very good in the 1929 competition of the UN building in Geneva, is that modernism itself was already in the decline in the 1920s. We can see that also in the student number of the Bauhaus University itself, they went down towards the late 1920s. And in 1929, for example, the competition of the new UN building, that time it was called Völkerbund, not UN yet, but it's the same organization, was an important international competitions. And nearly all architects who took part submitted works not in the modern style anymore. Instead of something that they call in America like strip classicism, like a reduced form of classicism. Only Le Corbusier was the only architect who still, let's say, as a Garde submitted a modernist design. Actually, I want to make a video only about this competition because it's so interesting and remarkable what happened there. Anyway, the outcome you see here. So it's more reduced form of classicism. And also when we look into America, okay, this building is 1937, but already before we have this kind of reduced form of classicism also in democratic countries. For example, here, the Parliament of Finland, democratic at that time, 1931. Reduced classicism. And this building is known to be the first building in that style from German architect Peter Behrens. It was 1911. Already built as a German embassy in St. Petersburg. Was built in this reduced classicism long before the Nazis came. So that means we could state more that it's kind of the style of the time of the late 1920s and early 1930s. So that's this reduced form of classicism, and architects themselves turned already away from modernism because it has proven several disadvantages that I talk about on my channel on. And you can see this in this other video here. And the Nazis just kind of employed the style that was already common. And then also Mussolini later in the early 1930s changed from the modernist style that was prevalent in the 1920s, as I showed before, to this reduced form of classicism. So famously the EUR Quarter in Rome, although I think this is still an even reduced and actually quite humble form of classicism that he employed there. So that really displayed the style of the time in the early 1930s. So, and then very interesting, when we look at that, what's that? That's a hand sketch done by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. And what do we see here? The Nazi cross. So why is it there? Because actually Mies van der Rohe and also Walter Gropius, the first and the last, Walter Gropius was the first director of the Bauhaus. And Mies van der Rohe was the last out of 3 directors of the Bauhaus. They both tried to work for Adolf Hitler, actually. They made designs in competitions held by Adolf Hitler, by the Nazi regime, and they wanted to work for him. So it's actually, I just show this to show that it's not true that then the modernists were the good ones, let's say the Bauhaus guys were the good ones, and the classicizmists the bad. So even the first and also the third and last director of Bauhaus, they applied to the Nazis and wanted to work for them. So this is a competition for the so-called Reichsbank. Actually, the realized building still exists at a very few Nazi buildings. It's not designed by either of them. It's designed by a very unknown architect from the 30s. And this building hosts now the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Germany. So it's still in use and existent. But this competition shows remarkably in 1933 that actually the Bauhaus guys tried to work for the Nazis, but they rejected. And also this one, 1934, competition held also by the Nazis. This was a work submitted again by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe for German Pavilion, because he designed the famous 1929 Barcelona Pavilion, and this one was his submission for that competition. And actually this is a very interesting design because he tried to evaluate how to combine modernism with monumentality. That's worth another video too. Maybe I do another video about that. So only this floor plan is so very, very interesting because it has elements of the open, fluid, etheric design of modernist architecture, and he's tried to combine it, for example, with these closed corners, with the definite space, so not the undefined space, but the defined and definite space from pre-modern or classical architecture. So it's actually a very interesting design of Mies van der Rohe. And I just want to point out, I don't blame those guys. So Walter Gropius or Mies van der Rohe, I don't blame them for want to work with Hitler and the Nazis, because to be frank, I would have done the same. I mean, when you live in Germany and you're an architect and you have a new prime minister, I mean, you don't immediately immigrate just because there's a new government. So you still want to work in your country and also with the current government. So I don't blame any of them. I just want to show that it's not true that the modernism and the Bauhaus guys were the good ones and the classicism is the bad one. And of course, when we look in the origin of classicism, it's more obvious. It was obviously developed and derived during the classic period in the Greek high culture. So when we look at those designs, these are reconstruction, we see that the classicism famously was developed during the time of the first democracy, so in Athens and the Greek cities, the polis. So it's a very democratic style, and probably that's also the reason why the United States have chosen them in the 18th century to be the state architecture. When we look at the White House or also the Capitol, these are in Washington, these are like famous buildings, let's say, related to the origin of classicism in the Greek democracy, because America at that time was proud of its constitution and the democracy. So it makes a lot of sense. So it's not true that classicism is fascistic and modernism is good. Now, I showed already 2 examples, and the last example is the funniest. When we look at that, what's that? Communism. So this is the most left political idea is communism that we currently have, right? And this was realized in Russia and in Eastern Europe. And this is how Lomonosov University, how communism express architecture. So that's neo-Renaissance. So if classicism is Nazi, then Renaissance is communism, or it's completely illogical, right? So my claim is that architecture itself is innocent already because it doesn't have a will and it cannot decide. And although obviously it's assigned by certain people, that means still architecture is like innocent because architecture can't decide consciously.